Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Medical Device Materials, the US and EU Biocompatibility Regulatory Landscape. It's great to see so many of you on the webinar today. I very much hope all of your friends, family and colleagues are continuing to keep safe and well. My name is Kieran Campbell. I'm a content director here at LSX Leaders based in London, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar in partnership with MCRA. As with our previous webinars, we do have a lot of our own community who are joining us today, but also a number of those from outside. So before we kick off, I wanted to briefly introduce LSX for those who don't know us. LSX stands for Life Science Executives. We're a community and network of senior life science decision makers across biotech, med tech, and health tech businesses, pharma companies, the full range of the investor base in life sciences, as well as payers and providers and other key stakeholders in the healthcare sector. Many people know us from our high-level, large-scale conferences, partnering events, and showcases that we run in Europe and the US. While these physical events are off the table for this period, we're really pleased to continue connecting people and sharing the expertise of our community through the other arm of our business, virtual partnering and various forms of digital content delivery, such as today's webinar. We're also delighted to be working with MCRA again for today's session, and indeed for this series. As a leading advisory firm and CRO for the medical device sector, with experience across regulatory, reimbursement, clinical research, healthcare compliance, and quality assurance, they are certainly the perfect partners for this series. Today, we're going to be focusing on one of these areas specifically, which is biocompatibility regulation. And I will very shortly be handing over to you our speaker and presenter for today, Rob Allen, Senior Associate for Regulatory Affairs. Rob has over 5 years of experience in regulatory affairs and international regulatory submissions. His expertise spans biocompatibility, pre-submission, investigational device exemption, pre-market approval, and clinical evaluation report. He is also a former FDA medical device lead and biocompatibility reviewer. I'd like to ensure we give a minute or two to allow any latecomers to join before I hand over to Robs, who will be guiding us through today's session. So just a couple of quick points to mention from me before we kick off. We will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation for me to put any questions you may have to Rob. So I would encourage all of you to please make use of this time, ask any questions or make any follow-ups from the presentation. Please do ask your question in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll look to answer as many of those as we can. You can also send me any questions you may have privately in the chat function if you wish. If you see a question that you wanted to ask in the Q&A already, you can upvote for that question to show that you're also interested in the answer, and we can look to address those first. So please do use this function and ask any questions you have at any point throughout the session. That's it from me. So now I will hand you over to Rob.
Yes, thank you, Kieran, and thank you very much to the LSX team for the opportunity to speak. Thanks also to everyone attending. I really appreciate your interest, and I'm excited to get started on this topic. So biocompatibility is my favorite topic across all regulatory affairs. So I always have a lot of fun talking about subsets within this category. And today, we're going to cover one of those subsets, which is medical device materials and how they relate to biocompatibility, which is a very important part of your regulatory submissions. And so the goals are going to be both to review these topics of medical device materials and biocompatibility, as well as to provide you with some recommendations for choosing your materials and your material suppliers. So here's what we'll cover in today's talk. I'll start with just a few quick words about MCRA, the company that I work for. And then I'll jump into the content of the talk. We'll discuss some myths associated with approved materials, and then introduce the concept of biocompatibility, walk through some of the fundamentals of biocompatibility, and then review how US regulators and EU regulators go about reviewing biocompatibility. With this background in mind, we will circle back to materials and discuss strategies for choosing materials and material suppliers. Then finally, I'll provide some concluding remarks and recommendations for the future. So thanks again to Kieran for introducing me. I'll just highlight one point in my background that's relevant to this talk, which is I served as a biocompatibility reviewer at the FDA prior to coming to MCRA. And at MCRA, I've continued to work in the biocompatibility space as a regulatory consultant. And just a few quick words about MCRA. We are a world-renowned medical device and biologics CRO and consulting firm with a track record of success. One thing to highlight is the 13 PMA approvals we have under our belt. So there's a lot of great information in this slide. I'll just focus on two key points that I think make MCRA really special. The first is the fact that we have integrated multiple strategic services for device companies all under one roof. We're talking about US and international regulatory affairs today, but we're also a clinical research clinical research organization, or CRO, meaning we run clinical studies. And we also advise our clients on reimbursement, manufacturing, and quality systems, among other services. So we really are a one-stop shop for medical device companies. In addition, we have depth in unique therapeutic areas, and this next slide kind of shows some of the areas we cover with depth. For me in particular, you can see all the way at the top of the screen here, cardiovascular is one of our areas of depth. That's my background. And then also biocompatibility is my other subspecialty. So at any rate, I am really pleased to be presenting on this topic under the MCRA banner, and certainly hope it can be helpful to our colleagues in the medical device industry. So now let's introduce the subject matter, and I thought it would be a nice starting point to talk about this concept of approved materials, which is often a starting point for folks who have not worked in the biocompatibility space before, but know medical devices in general. So I'll start with a quick pre-test. Which of the following are FDA approved materials? PEEK, PBAX, ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, nitinol, or Ti-6-4, which is a titanium alloy. So this is actually a trick question intended to illustrate a point. The answer is none, and I'll borrow language from FDA's 2016 biocompatibility guidance to explain why. And that says that the FDA does not clear or approve individual materials that are used in the fabrication of medical devices. Similarly, European notified bodies are not going to be green-lighting medical devices just because they contain commonly used medical device materials. So rather, what regulators are going to be considering is the biological safety of the final finished medical device based on a wide range of factors that include but are not limited to those materials. And if this is news to you, that's understandable. Biocompatibility review has changed over the years. So years ago, under the European MDD and in some corners of FDA, the following phrases could get you pretty far in your biocompatibility review. Things like, this material has a long history of safe use, or we've had our materials on the market for X number of years with no complaints related to biocompatibility. However, today, regulators are going to be asking you about more than just these histories. They'll be asking about the raw materials you use and their properties, then also your manufacturing and downstream processing and how that can impact biocompatibility for your device. They'll also be thinking about and asking you about this concept of extractable and leachable chemicals, which are not the materials themselves, but chemicals that can reside on the surface of your device or be present within the device and released later into the patient. And lastly, other factors not related to the chemistry of the device or the materials of the device may also come up, including surface properties and geometry. And part of the reason why we've had a shift over the years is because regulators are aligning their review practices with the up-to-date scientific thinking in the field of biocompatibility. So to really understand what regulators are looking for, it's important to know a little bit about biocompatibility. And that's why this first part of the talk is effectively a biocompatibility 101. And we'll use that foundation to then circle back and talk in more detail about materials. So let's get into that Biocompatibility 101, and we'll start with the basics. So what is biocompatibility and why do we care? So if you can take a look at the upper left-hand corner of the screen, we have the official word-for-word definition of biocompatibility borrowed from the ISO standard. And that is, biocompatibility is the ability of a medical device or material to perform with an appropriate host response in a specific application. So what this means in plain English is it's the impact of the materials, their processing, and other factors such as the device design, surface properties, and geometry on patient safety. And what are these patient safety outcomes we're talking about? Well, these patient safety outcomes, you may have recognized some of these terms when looking at clinical data. Things like adverse tissue reaction, necrosis, chronic inflammation, shock, blood clotting or thromboembolism, even cancer. These are adverse events that can be caused if your medical device is not biocompatible. Then what does this all mean from a regulatory perspective? Well, biocompatibility is a critical section in your regulatory submissions, and it's a very common section in your regulatory submissions too. Every patient contacting medical device is going to have this section. Similarly, this is also commonly a topic in deficiencies sent in letters from the FDA. And just how common? Well, in our experience recently, most deficiency letters coming from the FDA do have some questions on biocompatibility. We're also seeing a trend in increased questions coming from European notified bodies on the same topic. So what does this all mean for your product as far as your timelines and costs go? Well, even on the front end, biocompatibility evaluation can be expensive. The testing costs can be high, and some testing more than others, but it's a suite of a large series of tests and or risk assessments. Additionally, some of these evaluations are also very time consuming. But the costs and time delays often come on the back end too. So if you haven't done biocompatibility right the first time, and taking a permanent implant as an example, you could be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in repeat testing costs and months to even years in delays. So because of this, it's really important to be thinking about biocompatibility for your device early. And part of what that means is selecting your device materials, your manufacturing processes, and even the design of the device with biocompatibility in mind. So in that past slide, I was highlighting how expensive and time-consuming biocompatibility can be. And you might be asking, well, how often does this really come up? And my answer is very often. In fact, more projects need biocompatibility than you might think. So it might be obvious that a new device or a new device component necessitates biocompatibility evaluation, as does a change in device materials. However, often overlooked are some other situations where regulators will likely ask about biocompatibility. These include manufacturing process changes, changes to your manufacturing site, and even supplier changes. And I want to take just a second to talk about supplier changes because they're often thought about as minor in the medical device industry, and they're very common in the medical device industry. And often these supplier changes come for reasons that are really not, basically they don't come by choice. Sometimes availability of suppliers is what drives these supplier changes. But even though these changes are common and often thought of as minor, they can be associated with a substantial regulatory burden. In fact, this has become one of the top pain points of our clients, and many clients are blindsided when a regulator asks them for a massive amount of justification and potentially test data to support those supplier changes. So just some examples of how common biocompatibility can come up in a regulatory submission. So that's the high level. Now let's talk about just a few of the fundamentals of biocompatibility. And these concepts are what your regulators are going to use to look at your device and your device materials. So let's start with the concept of biocompatibility endpoints. So biocompatibility is broken out into many different aspects, and these are called biocompatibility endpoints. And just to give you a flavor for how many of these there are, I've placed in the slide here a screenshot from FDA's 2016 biocompatibility guidance. So this lists most, but not all, of the biocompatibility endpoints that might apply to your medical device. And so many of these are completely separate and some overlap between each other. I won't go through all of these, but just to give you a flavor for what these are, if you take a look all the way on the left here at cytotoxicity, this biocompatibility endpoint evaluates the potential for your device to cause cells to die inside a patient. And so that endpoint is separate from something called material-mediated pyrogenicity, which evaluates the capacity of your device to increase the body temperature in a patient. So all in all, there are 14 of these biocompatibility endpoints, and 11 of these endpoints are commonly addressed for medical devices. One other thing to note is most devices won't address all 11 of those common endpoints, but instead a subset of those endpoints. And a key concept in biocompatibility is deciding which biocompatibility endpoints need to be assessed. And that's typically determined by two factors primarily. The first being type and duration of patient contact. So that's how does the device contact the patient? What parts of the body? And also how long is that contact? And the second is the device materials and the downstream processing. So that transitions nicely into this slide of what drives biocompatibility. So what device characteristics really impact those biocompatibility endpoints? So clearly, based on even the title of this talk and common knowledge, we know that device materials can inherently impact biocompatibility. There's many materials out there, some of which were in that pretest question, there's many materials out there that have a pretty well characterized response to the host tissue. Things like peak, depending on the supplier and downstream processing, PBACs for blood contacting devices that come in short contact with the patient. There are also device materials you might recognize that do have adverse effects. For example, latex is known to cause cytotoxicity, and nitrile, another glove material, can cause blood clotting or thrombogenicity. And I also touched on that concept of patient contact already, but you can intuitively imagine that if you take a material and you implant that into a patient's muscle, you can have different and substantially more impact on the host, basically the patient's tissue and systemic health, as compared to if you were just placing that material on the outside of the patient's skin, for example, as a strap on a wearable device. Another important concept is the idea of extractable and leachable chemicals. So these are not the device materials themselves, but chemicals that can rest on the surface of the device or be found within the device and then potentially release into the patient. So a common example of a surface chemical comes up in metallic implants. So if they're not washed properly, they may contain residual machining oils, and we have seen that as something that can potentially adversely impact patients. As for extractables, leachables found within the device, many polymers contain plasticizers as a known additive, and they may also have other known additives or impurities. These are things that you may not come out if you are doing a quick cleaning step for the device, yet they may still reside in the device and release into the patient after contact with the patient. Lastly, two other elements of biocompatibility, which might make sense intuitively, but they're often overlooked. These don't have anything to do with the chemistry or the specific material used. These are surface roughness or surface topography and shape and geometry. So a good quick example of the impact of surface roughness or topography is the concept of textured versus smooth breast implants. So there's a lot going on in that situation, but just to, for the sake of explanation, you can imagine we're talking about the same material here, but a different surface topography. And as we know from those news stories about the issues with textured breast implants, you can get a very different host response just based on that surface topography. And then similarly, shape and geometry can impact local tissue effects as well. So I've shown here just just for the sake of illustration, a shape with of a potential medical device that has a protrusion and a sharp point. As might be intuitively obvious, if you were to implant this subcutaneously in a patient, you may have local tissue damage or irritation, and you may not have that same effect if you were to take the same materials but have a smoother, rounded surface. Again, pretty simple concept, but this is often overlooked in biocompatibility evaluations done by medical device manufacturers. So lots of different drivers of biocompatibility and different aspects of biocompatibility. There's also multiple tools for assessing biocompatibility. So this slide walks through some of those tools. The first one, and what is most commonly thought of when we're dealing with biocompatibility, is biological testing. And that is exposing the device or chemicals that come out of the device to animals or in vitro test systems involving cells. Then we also have chemical testing. Chemical testing measures the types of types and amounts of chemicals found within the medical device. Chemical testing is often followed up by risk assessments, in which we are evaluating the biological risk associated with those chemicals, both the types and amounts of chemicals, based on known data or information that can be inferred from known data on similar types of chemicals. Then lastly, we have rationales. So these are explanations for why biocompatibility biocompatibility testing or risk assessment is not needed. And the most common form of rationales are explanations for why the biocompatibility of one device or one material should be the same as another. So if it seems like there's a lot to remember there, that's true. But the good news is this information is all documented in standards and guidances that you can have access to. So the overarching standard for biocompatibility is ISO 10993 Part 1, published and released in 2018. That's that overarching standard. And then we also have a guidance document from FDA released in 2016. This guidance document explains FDA's interpretation of an earlier version of that standard. And finally, we have a whole series of other standards in the ISO 10993 series. These standards cover the specific tests and risk assessments used for each of those biocompatibility endpoints we discussed earlier. So that's the Biocompatibility 101. Now let's talk about what that looks like in action when regulators are reviewing your submissions. So this slide here shows a simplified flowchart of how an FDA biocompatibility reviewer might go about doing their review. And just as a disclaimer, this is not an official flowchart, but this is basically based on my understanding and experience. So, and I'll use this pointer to help you follow along. So the two primary drivers of the biocompatibility review are the type and duration of patient contact and the materials and manufacturing processes. So these two inputs really drive the answers to two key questions that your regulators are going to be asking. Those are, which biocompatibility endpoints does the manufacturer need to evaluate? And then, are there any material-specific concerns that necessitate custom test methods or other considerations beyond those what's done in a standard way for those biocompatibility endpoints? And the answers to these questions will drive where the bar is going to be for that biocompatibility reviewer in reviewing the information you provide, which will be either rationale or testing, a combination of testing and or risk assessment. So as might be clear just from the flow chart, the direction of the arrows here, device materials play a pretty prominent role in driving the biocompatibility review of a medical device. So I've highlighted in blue text some of the things that materials can determine in that review. So one of the things they can impact are the biocompatibility endpoints that need to be evaluated. So I had mentioned before that some biocompatibility endpoints are not commonly evaluated, yet are listed in the standard. So material choice can potentially drive your regulators to ask about those biocompatibility endpoints. And basically, they'll be doing that in a for-cause manner, which is why, just for the sake of this talk, I'm calling those endpoints for-cause endpoints. So what are these aspects of biocompatibility? They include things like neurotoxicity, developmental and reproductive toxicity. And yeah, I apologize. I think I'm missing one there. But these for-cause endpoints can be asked based on your materials. And a good example is if you have a material in your device that is made with a known reproductive toxin, then FDA is likely to ask you to add developmental and reproductive toxicity to your list of biocompatibility endpoints to evaluate. And then with respect to material-specific concerns, the time this most often comes up, in my experience, is if you have chemicals in your device or the materials themselves have known toxicities associated with them, but there are technical issues in detecting those toxicities using the standard test methods. So a good example here is if your device contains formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is a chemical with known toxicities. However, regulators know that it can be difficult to detect formaldehyde if you're just doing the standard chemical characterization test method for when you're screening for all the different chemicals that could be in your device. So the output of these material-specific questions and any for-cause biocompatibility endpoints will be potential additional testing, risk assessments, and even custom test methods. One other important potential output of what materials you choose and the downstream processing you use is the ability to potentially provide successful rationales to your regulator for why biocompatibility does not need further testing or risk assessment. So a lot of conditions have to be met and for rationales to work. But generally speaking, the rationale needs to apply to both the material and the downstream processing. And there needs to be enough information out there on the material and the impact of those downstream processes for the rationale to be successful. So that was how things might look walking through the FDA process. Now let's take a look at how a notified body might look at biocompatibility. So the black text in this flowchart represents the same steps or questions that notified body reviewers are going to be asking. And then as you can see, there are two purple elements here. those elements are parts of the process that are somewhat unique to your European Notified Body Review. And this flowchart here is based on the new ISO 10993 standard. So what are these two additional considerations? Well, the first is an expectation for physical or chemical information. And that is, what that's going to look like is you'll be expected to list all of the materials and processing chemicals used in the manufacture of your device. So, and I should clarify that the FDA does also want to see that type of list. But then you'll go an extra step and provide detailed physical and chemical information on all of those constituents of your device. Then from there, you'll want to be conducting a risk assessment in which you take all that information on those constituents of your device and look at all the available information on their biocompatibility that's out there. So at this point, it's possible that there may be enough information, for example, published in literature, to fully address the biocompatibility for your device. However, if there are any gaps in that information, you'll need to then address those gaps with rationale or with further testing and risk assessment. So two key things to highlight here are, number one, as you can see from the flow of these arrows, materials matter potentially even more for notified body review as they drive these two unique elements of what you need to provide to European notified bodies. Additionally, and this is a really important point that comes up for folks that have experience with the US FDA, it is likely insufficient for you to just conduct the standard battery of biocompatibility tests to satisfy European regulators. Instead, we anticipate that you'll need to be looking at your materials and your processing and providing those unique elements that of evaluation that the notified bodies are looking for. There's one other important requirement that's getting a lot of buzz right now. A lot of folks are talking about this, and that is the CMR and ER requirements listed in the regulation of the European MDR. So I've pasted in the exact text here and won't read it word for word, but basically what these requirements mean is, in general, devices need to contain less than 0.1% by weight of any substances which are carcinogenic, mutagenic, toxic to reproduction, or have endocrine disrupting properties. And where we expect the bar is going to be with this is there will be a need to provide chemical information on your raw materials, your processing materials, and potentially even your final finished device to meet these CMR ER requirements. So that's the Biocompatibility 101 and the walkthrough of what regulators are going to be looking for. So with that background in mind, let's circle back to device materials and suppliers and recommend some strategies. And when you're thinking about strategies, a couple key things to think about include, can we use well-characterized materials, or should we be using novel materials in our device? And also, what are we looking for when we're choosing our suppliers? So let's start with some pros and cons about well-characterized materials versus novel materials. And I think I might be preaching to the choir here because most medical device manufacturers try to use well-characterized materials whenever they can. And that's likely because of these well-known advantages. From a biocompatibility perspective, they avoid things like those 4-cause endpoints, which I mentioned earlier. Rationales may be possible rather than testing, provided that certain conditions are met. And also, depending on the supplier, there may be detailed proprietary information that's available on this material and already on file with your regulators. And these are known as master files. However, there are some limitations even to those advantages with well-characterized materials. So, for example, you will still need to be providing detailed raw material information to satisfy European regulators. For all regulators, you'll still need to consider how your manufacturing processes impact biocompatibility. And chemical characterization testing may still be needed for European notified bodies, basically in the case that the characterization of these well-characterized materials still is not detailed enough. When we look at using novel materials, the advantages and disadvantages are basically flipped. If we start by looking at limitations, so those questions on for-cause endpoints, you may get them if you're using novel materials. Rationales are going to be unlikely to succeed because these novel materials, by definition, have not been evaluated for biocompatibility in front of the regulatory body before. And there may be those material-specific concerns related to testing. Of course, we certainly don't want to discourage innovation in this talk, and there are often major advantages to using novel materials. For example, a novel material may be just what you need to improve device performance, for example, improving strength or durability. And you may also have business reasons for using novel materials, such as intellectual property reasons or marketing reasons. So with that background in mind, here's some questions that you'll want to ask yourself when developing your strategy for choosing materials and suppliers. So first of all, can well-characterized materials be used without sacrificing performance? If the answer is yes to that, then you may want to consider using those materials instead of that new material you've heard about that sounds enticing. Then some questions to ask yourself to help you decide what you're looking for in a supplier. What is your tolerance for variability in the materials coming from the supplier? And what supplier controls and receiving specifications are you willing to use to further mitigate any of those risks? And then lastly, another question to ask is, can we, as in, so you, the company, still budget for follow-on testing? Even with the best regulatory advisement, there's still always that chance that your regulators will want some kind of follow-on testing beyond what you've conducted. And many device manufacturers do get blindsided and are not ready for that request. So we certainly recommend having some buffer available to be able to field that request if it comes. And we also have a lot of potential questions you want to ask your supplier. But I do think all these are important. So I'll quickly go through these questions now. The top question that I would ask a supplier first is, do you supply this material for other US or EU legally marketed devices? And the reason this is so important is it can unlock the potential to provide rationales rather than new testing to your regulators for at least some aspects of biocompatibility. Then there's also a series of questions you can ask to de-risk whether there are going to be chemicals of concern found in your material from the supplier. Questions including, what chemicals do you use in your processing? What steps do you take to remove unwanted chemicals? And importantly, does your material meet Europe's CMR ER requirements? And for that last question, you may not be surprised if the answer is, I don't know, or possibly. Both device manufacturers and suppliers are still working to really implement how to address these requirements. But it's certainly an important question to ask, and it's something that you will need to address at some point in your regulatory pathway. Then also questions involving what test data is already available on these materials. Questions like what routine testing do you conduct on your material? And do you have a master file? And if so, what topics does that master file cover? So one important note on master files is just because a master file is on file with a regulator doesn't mean that it covers all of what the regulator is looking for. So it's definitely important to take stock of what's going to be in that master file when you're deciding what data you think you'll need to collect yourself. And lastly, and this is probably the most, maybe the second most important question, will you discuss proprietary details of your materials with regulators? So this is an important question because in my experience, we've seen the yes or no answer from regulators coming down to a phone call between the regulator and the supplier. So if it comes to that, you want to make sure that your supplier is ready and willing to pick up the phone and work with your regulator. So that covers all the background information and overall tips. But I do want to give two examples, kind of walking through what are the advantages of using a well-characterized material through the full review process. And just for the sake of demonstration and simplicity, I'm going to use that FDA flowchart. So if we take a look at the situation where we have a permanent implant that comes in contact with tissue or bone, and we choose a well-characterized material that's commonly used in the medical device industry. In this case, the example is Ti-6-4, which is titanium alloy. We can quickly see that there's certainly a simplified regulatory process moving forward. When it comes to that question, which biocompatibility endpoints do we need to evaluate? Well, right off the bat, because of the type and duration of patient contact, there are going to be 10 different biocompatibility endpoints that need to be evaluated. But because we're using this well-characterized material, we will not expect any for-cause endpoints to be requested. Similarly, our regulators know how to deal with Ti-6-4. And so we're not going to have any material-specific concerns that lead to custom test methods or additional tests. And what's really exciting is, provided that certain conditions are met, we may be able to provide a rationale that covers some or all of the biocompatibility endpoints. Again, that rationale needs to cover both the biocompatibility of the material and the impacts of downstream processing, as well as the device design, for example, surface properties and geometry. Of course, you've got to think about all the biocompatibility endpoints, and depending on the exact details of the situation, for example, if your design has a different shape or different surface roughness than other designs, you may still need to conduct testing, but only for that relevant endpoint. So an implantation study may or may not be needed. So what would it look like if you used a novel material as the implant material instead? So this slide is intended to show that novel materials can mean further biocompatibility work. And probably right away your eye is coming to this rationale graphic. Because it's a novel material, by definition, it has not been evaluated for biocompatibility in front of this regulator, and it's unlikely that a rationale is going to work. But let's imagine we have a unique polymer, so something new, and that it contains an isocyanate crosslinker, which is a highly reactive chemical with potential toxicities. Well, we may need to add some for-cause endpoints to our evaluation, and which endpoints we have to add will depend on the chemistry of the polymer, as well as any known or expected impurities. And then we may have additional material-specific concerns. So I already mentioned that isocyanate. So there's certainly going to be some biocompatibility risks associated with that isocyanate. But then because the isocyanate is so reactive, we may need custom test strategies to evaluate how much isocyanate is really there. And we may have to consider whether the real toxicity from isocyanate would actually show up in a standard biocompatibility test. Similarly, we'll have to walk through the impurities, so the known and expected impurities in this polymer, and determine whether any of them have unique risks, toxicological risks. And if so, are there any issues with detecting them using the standard testing? So ultimately, what the output of this biocompatibility evaluation is going to be, it's likely going to involve chemical testing, so both screening tests and targeted chemical analyses, as well as risk assessment and biological testing. And that biological testing may involve custom test methods. So now to conclude and provide a few recommendations for the future. One of the main points of this talk was that biocompatibility is really important for your bottom line. It's a set of resource-intensive evaluations, and it's getting increasing increasing scrutiny from regulators. We've also highlighted that material choice and supplier choice are critical components when looking at biocompatibility for your device. They can impact your regulatory costs and time, and therefore we recommend you consider these early in your developmental phase. And lastly, we focused a lot on materials and suppliers today, but don't forget about those other factors that can impact biocompatibility as well. So looking to the future, we expect to see more requests for chemical characterization testing and risk assessments, especially for European submissions. And I think that highlights, review practices and even the standards themselves have been evolving, and they're going to continue to evolve. So we encourage device manufacturers to continually be thinking about how these things are going to change over time. So consider the life cycle of your development of a medical device. If it takes you 5 to 10 years to develop that medical device, you want to be cautious about what testing you've conducted early in that process. It's possible that those tests have become obsolete near the end. So the recommendation here is to keep your ear to the ground as far as what the trends in biocompatibility as well as other aspects of regulation are going to be, and adapt accordingly. And along the same lines, it's a good idea to conduct a biocompatibility gap analysis at certain regulatory milestones, such as before your design freeze, before submitting an IDE submission, and before your marketing application. Final recommendations, again, think about biocompatibility early, and it can save you time and money on the back end. Talk to your regulators if you have questions on, if you have specific test methods that you're not sure about. It's going to be better to get their feedback instead of just conducting the testing and hoping they'll accept it. And also, don't forget that you always have the option to go out and get expert help, and it's something I strongly encourage. And just one last point on expert help. So where are you going to find these biocompatibility experts? Well, you may have in-house expertise, and you certainly want to be looking to the test labs that conduct the testing. I think you also want to consider third-party consultants. So this is, that's 3 bullet points right there. But I really think it's important to note that biocompatibility is often a team approach. And part of the reason so many minds need to get involved here is because there's many aspects of biocompatibility. You have that regulatory side of biocompatibility, but there's also a very rich science basis. And it really marries at least 3 different sciences, including toxicology, chemistry, and biology. So we certainly encourage you to seek biocompatibility expertise to help you through your processing. But I would encourage you to make sure that your biocompatibility experts have all these areas covered to maximize your chances for regulatory success. So that concludes all the content I have. Thank you again for your interest and attention, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was excellent. And yeah, as you say, we do have quite a few questions. Keen to get to as many of these as we can in the time that we have remaining. So I'll get right to it. Start off with one of the highly voted questions by an anonymous attendee. When changing material suppliers, how can we prove to regulatory bodies that the material from the new supplier is chemically equivalent to the previous supplier?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the fact of the matter is, right now, it's not totally clear where the bar is. So, generally speaking, the commonly taken approach is to contract with a test lab and conduct a chemical characterization test. you'll be conducting, typically be conducting a screening test looking at the full chemical extractable leachable profile. However, there's a big challenge here, which is, it's not really established, it's not clearly established what is the criteria for saying these two materials are equivalent. So we certainly know what tests you want to do, but where is the bar? And unfortunately, what we've found in our recent experience with this exact question is if there are any different chemicals that come out of that material, or if the amounts of chemicals that come out of the material, if you have more chemical coming out of the material into your new supplier than your previous supplier, it's going to be a toss-up how the regulator deals with those issues. I apologize for not having a perfect answer to that question, but we often will try to see if there's an alternative approach that doesn't require comparing two chemical profiles. So oftentimes you can, if you discuss with your supplier in detail, you might find that they're using this exact material in another legally marketed device. And so that can potentially open up a pathway of providing a rationale that this material change should not adversely impact biocompatibility. But I'd certainly be happy to discuss that question further. And it really, I think the solution is going to depend on exactly what the device is and what the material is.
Fantastic, thank you, Rob. Next question from Haribabu Sudhausanan. What if cytotoxicity tests fail and all other in vivo tests passed? What is expected additionally by regulatory bodies to approve the device? Sorry, I stumbled there. Would you like me to...
that is a good question. Yeah.
Okay, so what if cytotoxicity tests fail and all other in vivo tests pass? Then what is expected additionally by regulatory bodies to approve the device?
Right. So it certainly can be frustrating to see that you don't have totally clean results. But we at the MCRA side and also the FDA side of things too, it's not an uncommon situation. The good news is a positive, or in this case, you would say an undesired result for one or two endpoints. It's not necessarily a death sentence for your device. If there's positive cytotoxicity, for example, often the next step will be a root cause analysis determining why, what is cytotoxic. And there are often multiple potential paths forward. So often this root cause analysis may include looking at your manufacturing processing. It may include creating some custom test articles and seeing, if you remove a certain raw material, do you get rid of that toxicity? So regulators like to be able to pinpoint what the source is, and that's typically the next step. The other thing that can help is pointing to your successful in vivo data. So cytotoxicity is about cell death, but it's more clinically relevant to look at the local tissue level and see whether your device is actually killing cells in the real clinical situation. So typically a root cause analysis in combination with highlighting that animal data can give you a good shot at satisfying the regulator, but the exact pathway may depend on what that root cause of cytotoxicity is and whether FDA or European notified bodies think it's reasonable to ask you to remove that source.
Awesome, thank you. Next question, an anonymous attendee has asked, in order to streamline the costs of manufacturing medical devices, in what situations can we consider changing medical grade materials to industrial grade materials? Can industrial grade materials be used for device components that may likely contact only intact skin?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think for contacting only intact skin, I think the answer is generally yes. It does depend on those materials, but for contacting intact skin, there's well, we want to break that up into an FDA expectation and notified body expectation because they may be different. On the FDA side, the key thing you'll need to be able to ensure is that you can pass those biocompatibility endpoint tests that are applicable for just skin contact. And so that's only a small subset of all those biocompatibility endpoints. Certainly chemical characterization testing would not be required there, but you'll want to make sure that you can ensure even from a quality perspective that your product is going to consistently pass those endpoints. And regulators may still, if there's a chemical of concern that's clearly going to be in that material, you may still get a for-cause question. So you want to at least vet those materials as well as you can on your end. You may not need to provide that to regulators. For European notified bodies, that may be more challenging because you still need to meet those expectations of providing chemical information and physical information on the materials, as well as meeting those CMR ER requirements. It's still possible to do, but you may need to conduct chemical analysis yourself and provide that to your regulators to satisfy those expectations.
Lovely, thank you. We do have quite a lot more questions, so we'll try and squeeze a couple more in. Can cytotoxicity testing be used to screen biocompatibility impacts of a device change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think this is commonly done sort of on the quality side of things. So the challenge here is regulatory bodies generally don't consider cytotoxicity to be indicative of all the other endpoints. So it can certainly be considered useful data, but if your decision ends up in front of, basically if your thought process for evaluating that material ends up in front of a regulator, they are likely to disagree that cytotoxicity alone can be used to screen the other endpoints. So that's not to say it can't be useful, but you'll need to supplement your screening with some other evaluations. For example, such as looking at the chemistry of the material, and things like looking at certificates of analysis and safety data sheets coming from that supplier. And of course, seeing if they supply the same material for other legally marketed devices.
Great, thank you. I think we can, we have time for one or two more if we make them quick. So if my suppliers, this is Gwenadi Psycho. If my suppliers provide me with a biocompatibility certificate, what does it mean from the submission perspective? Is it not enough just to attach the certificate?
Yeah, this is another really good question. Happens all the time. So it really depends on the content of the certificate and the magnitude of the change. If we're just talking about a material change, it could be enough, but it's going to depend on the content. And one great example I can give is if your supplier sends you a certificate saying that this material has successfully gone through the USP, I think it's class 6 testing. It's certainly a great start, so that covers several biocompatibility endpoints, but it doesn't cover all of them. It's not going to cover all of them because it doesn't typically contain cytotoxicity. So you'll really want to look at exactly what tests were conducted and if there are any chemical analyses, and then do your gap analysis and try to match that up to what regulators might be looking for. And the key challenge there is going to be if this decision making comes in front of a regulator, that's what they're going to be looking for. And certainly on the quality side of things, your bar for vetting that supplier may be lower than that regulatory expectation. But I would recommend trying to meet that regulatory expectation, because if it comes down to a question on the pre-market side, a regulator may end up looking at your thought process and judging it accordingly.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we'll have to make this the last question from an anonymous attendee who says, first of all, thank you for this, Rob. And second of all, why isn't it sufficient to just provide the master file and letter of reference for a material change? Shouldn't it contain everything the regulators need to make a decision?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that question. So I think the key element of the answer is that regulators don't pre-review master files. So any raw material supplier can submit a master file to a regulator, and because it's proprietary, you won't know the content of that master file. And because it's not pre-reviewed, it may or may not be sufficient for the regulator. So really, I think that highlights the importance of asking your supplier what's in the master file, and if you're really savvy, ask them what specific tests have you conducted. Are you willing to at least tell us that? Unfortunately, there's not a perfect solution to this because the content is proprietary. So you really can't know all the details of what's in it. Otherwise, they would just send it to you. So if they're using a master file, it means that there are going to be some things you don't know and won't know until the review from the regulator is conducted.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And that sadly is all we have time for, but I want to say thank you very much to everyone who joined us today, and a huge thank you to Rob for sharing his expertise with everyone today. As mentioned, we will be releasing the slides to all attendees, and I'm sure Rob will be very happy to discuss the content of the presentation and any ways that MCRA may be able to help you in your business after the webinar. We'll be sending a follow-up email to all of you who are registered as soon as possible, which will include a link to the full recorded webinar. The next webinar in the MCRA series will be a digital health focused presentation taking place in late August in the run-up to our Health Tech Leaders virtual event, which for its part takes place across the 15th to the 18th of September. Hope very much to see you all there. So thanks again to Rob, and thank you to all of you for joining us, and see you all very soon.
Thank you, everyone.